Question from the floor, Mark.
Representative, do you feel that the length of the term that you currently serve is adequate for you to complete your job?
Well, I'm gonna give you two answers. First answer is no. But the second answer is why, and how it pertains to money in politics and my deep, profound frustration with how much money is suffocating the life out of true representation. 2 years, that's it. That's all I got, right? On annual, at every term. You get in the office, get yourself situated, you get your office, you get your staff, you build out your in-district team, you start thinking about your alleged priorities, you're feeling good. You look up 2-3 months into your term and you realize, oh, wait a second, you gotta raise money because somebody's coming for you. And if you don't start doing that, what's gonna happen? They're gonna start putting ads on TV and digital things. There's a machine out there that no matter how hard you try, you've got to pay some attention to. You have to in order to maintain your ability to serve the community. So I found deep frustration in that, and I've long talked about the need for capping the amount of terms. It'll be 10 years total, right? However, if you say it's 2 years, or sorry, 3 terms, well, half that time is going to be spent, unfortunately, trying to survive politically in this horrible climate. So I'm also open to the idea of extending the length of the term too, right? If we're talking 3-year terms, well, then maybe we can have less of a cap on actually the amount of terms. So these are the things that I think are important. I do think that at the end of the day, career politicians, those who've been there for years and years and years and made an entire lifelong career out of it, aren't doing a lot of good for us right now. But we need fresh ideas, we need fresh blood, we need individuals who are engaged in their communities, who understand the dynamics on the ground, who are able to best reflect those desires and be champions for them.
Also, as a CPA and a small business owner, my biggest cost, mine, all right, is labor, and my second is healthcare. I'm a rarity. I pay 100% of the healthcare cost for my employees.
Wow.
All right? It gets tougher each year.
It sure does, and that's why, if you could tell, I concluded my remarks on what I think would be a good step to help us deal with this reality for far too many folks across this country.
First of all, I love your first name. It's a good one.
Well, thank you. My mom liked it. Here.
So I'm curious about how we transition from Obamacare, into what we're going to have, and the concern is where is the health care for all mentality, or in terms of everyone should have health care in this country, in my opinion. So how do we get there from the mess that we're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, as I noted, I think that we are best positioned. We were only, I think, a vote away back when the ACA was passed from a public option. We don't have to overhaul the entire system. It's 1/6 of our economy. It's big. Right? But what we can do is inject a public competitor into the system and make sure that there's at least a floor that'll drive down the premiums and drive down the deductibles. We have that introduction of a public option to our system will go a long way, because there are a lot of countries in the world, a lot of developed countries, I should say, 33 or so, 33. We're the only developed one without some form of universal health care, some form, whether it's a single payer system, whether it's a public option. We don't have anything in any vein, and we have got to change that, primarily because we're the wealthiest country in the world. How can you be the wealthiest country in the world and be the only developed country in the world without some form of universal health care?
And $4 trillion on healthcare is kind of sort of enough, isn't it?
Yeah, the cost of health care right now and the quality of care we're getting in return don't add up. We got to fix that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I have 2 questions, and I'll let you answer either one you'd want to talk about.
Thank you, sir.
That's going to be more fair, right? So I'd like to talk to you about the government shutdown process, or I would like to talk to you about your comments having to do with the deficit. You want to talk about either one of those?
Well, I mean, I already addressed the deficit and the debt issue, and I'd imagine that folks in this room might want to hear my thoughts on a new topic.
Okay.
So I can do the shutdown.
So I read that there are two proposals that deal with potential shutdowns of the government, and both of them have some form of non-payment to other branches of the government. I think one of them basically said there will be no, if we shut down the government, then the full legislative branch, including all of the aides and the staffing, would not be paid. And just to be fair, a fair disclosure to you, my daughter is in the FBI, and she was one of the people that, number one, went to work and didn't get paid, and also was informed that, by the way, if you don't come out of pocket and pay your whatever you contribute to your medical, your family loses your medical during the shutdown. And she wasn't real happy about that. So
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts? Maybe you can't commit to that, but
I'm aware of the legislation and happy to speak about it.
okay, great.
Just stepping back, big picture though. The longest shutdown in this country's history, as a new member of Congress, I can tell you it was a bit disorienting, trying to figure out the lay of the land in the midst of the longest shutdown in the government, in the country's history. And it was profoundly irresponsible and reckless on a lot of levels. Not just the 800,000 federal workers, over 4,000 or so who work in our district, some of whom I personally met with, from the Coast Guard to SEC employees who commute 5.5 hours a day, right? Individuals who are being told to work time and time again and not be paid, worrying about how they're going to put food on their kids' tables or pay for their kids' tuitions. And I'm seeing this up close and personal. And all I kept thinking to myself was, how do we end up in this mess? And how broken is our system that we get to a place where we're holding everyday Americans hostage over a policy dispute. That's all it is, a policy dispute. What the government ought to be making its bones doing. That's what we're there to do. And we're holding the American people hostage because we can't do our job. And that's a profound problem. And then what I tried to do in the midst of all this was, aside from meeting with individuals across the district, letter campaigns, I also wanted to do my best to demonstrate solidarity, didn't take any pay during the shutdown. It was important for me to actually to do this work. And then I started thinking about, as you have alluded to, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? There are a number of bills that have been presented, a few of which I took a look at, a few I tried to amend to do exactly what you're saying. There's a bill that is making its way through the House right now, which I feel like doesn't go far enough, which is what you're talking about, that would say, in the event the shutdown is looming, the government is going to prevent that because we'll have automatic funding at the levels in the previous year, maybe an adjustment for inflation, adjustment for population changes, and index that out. And then that's all the bill does. I didn't necessarily like that proposal because it shirks our responsibilities as a body. It also doesn't fully account for, in a meaningful way, inflation and things that might matter or change how we fund programs. It also can handcuff your ability to invest if there are certain budgetary constraints that have already been implemented in prior years. And it's our job to figure this all out. However, to your point, and no member of Congress has put forth legislation that does exactly this yet. If we say that we can do that, automatically continue the budget from prior year, but then hold in escrow the salaries of members of Congress and the executive branch until we figure out how to properly fund the government, that is a bill I can get behind. And believe me, the challenge is trying to find a lot of other individuals in Congress who think this way, to be honest. A lot of new members think this way, but not so many others. And we're in the minority. So I think it's important that we continue to do this work, but the idea that it's actually going to make its way through the House and through the Senate, just speaking realistically with you here, is going to be incredibly difficult. But you can sign me up as somebody who would vote for such legislation. Absolutely.
Michelle?
This is a little bit self-interest and, well, about my cause. But I will ask you, and then I'm going to turn the mic really quick over to my colleague here who has something connected to what I'm saying. You talked about healthcare, and we talked about the cost of Alzheimer's. Ford said over 200, billion right now that we're paying for around this table. There is such a huge, huge need for Alzheimer's research and related dementias. Huge need. And we've been sort of languishing behind some of the other very, very important diseases that are taking us all down, so to speak. So soon, you're going to be asked to allow more money to be allocated to Alzheimer's research and dementia research through the National Institutes for Health. Will you support that?
Yes.
Thank you.
That was easy.
Where's the easy button? That was easy. And just following up on what Michelle has said and following up on your words about wanting to work across the aisle and work in a bipartisan manner, there is in Congress a task force, a bipartisan congressional task force on Alzheimer's disease. It is truly bipartisan. I think we have one independent member and a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans. We say that Alzheimer's is not a red issue, it's not a blue issue, it's a purple issue. And so I would encourage you, Congressman Delgado, to consider becoming a part of the bipartisan task force on Alzheimer's in Congress.
I appreciate you flagging that. I've made it, and I'll make a larger point on this. There are a lot of caucuses in Congress. You got your New Dems, your Blue Dogs, your Progressive Caucus. You have a whole bunch of caucuses. I didn't join any of the caucuses because, to me, we're living in a time where there's so much partisanship, and the labeling comes to define you, no matter what you say. And people could just throw that label out there and let it speak for yourself, speak for you. I'd rather speak for myself. That being said, though, I have made an exception where there are bipartisan caucuses. So I was one of the founding members of the PFAS bipartisan coalition, which is meant to help and highlight and prioritize how we can deal with PFAS contaminants, which are plaguing communities all across the district, the country, and including our district of Hoosick Falls and in Petersburg. I'm also a part of the bipartisan Lyme disease caucus. I'm also a part of the rural broadband bipartisan caucus. Notice the theme, bipartisan, right, in every caucus. And I will certainly flag this one as well. And just continue to ensure that I put myself in front of as many diverse political actors as possible, because too often we're separated and we don't get a chance to actually interact and engage with each other, but we ought to be.
Hi, I'm Don Badgley from New Paltz, New York. First, I want to thank you
Thank
for
you.
being our representative.
Appreciate it.
You are representing all of us, and that is a precious gift to all of us, and we need to recognize it every day. I thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I'm an independent, one of that third. I've never registered in a party, and I try to get along with everybody. We're witnessing something in our country right now that is unprecedented. We're as divided as we've been since the American Civil War. And there's a toxicity I have never witnessed in my life. What do we do as citizens to calm that? And what do you do as a congressman? You've already mentioned bipartisan work. What can you do? How do you reach across to someone who, because of your designation, thinks you're evil?
Great question. So I tell you, you're right. There is a lot of toxicity, a lot of divisiveness, a lot of hate, fear-mongering. I'm going to address two things here. I think a lot of the reason why that is the case It's not an accident. I actually believe that it's part of a mentality or a strategy to, in effect, distract a lot of folks from the struggles and the realities and the pains and the anxieties that are affecting people all across the country, no matter your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, or your religion. When you got 80% of the country sharing just 20% of the wealth, that's a lot of people who are struggling. When you have half the country not able to survive a $500 medical emergency bill without going into debt, that doesn't know color, that doesn't know gender or sexual orientation, right? That's half the country. When you have 80% of folks living paycheck to paycheck in this country, that's a lot of people irrespective of difference. And so when you start hearing folks talk about difference and divisiveness, you could make a strong case that it's meant to create a sense of distraction from these shared pains. Because when you are fighting for crumbs, when you're fighting for scraps, when you're struggling to get by, it is human nature, instinctive, to turn tribal. It is human nature to want to close ranks, to become protectionist, because you have this sense of scarcity. But that scarcity, I would contend, is an illusion. And it is important that we actually have actors in DC who are determined to fight for sharing our prosperity and making sure that we invest, as I spoke about, in our future. And I will talk about this and speak about this and champion policies that do just that for as long as I sit in this seat. And on top of that, I will go to every single part of this district, no matter how red, no matter how independent, no matter how blue. I will be there. And I will engage, and I will have conversations, and I will listen. Because one of the things that I have found at just about every town hall, we go to towns that aren't democratically friendly towns, you could say, right? And we have town halls. And I intentionally do that to do exactly what you're talking about, to make sure that they get a sense of who I am, the person, the real me, the real me, right? To get a sense of that. I'll tell you a quick story. Yesterday, we were in Montgomery County, Kennedy Heritage, doing a town hall. And there was a bunch of folks in the room who did not vote for me. Okay? But it was a great conversation. It was respectful, it was civil. We spoke about the issues that mattered, from the debt to border security, host of things. I had 2 or 3 individuals walk up to me, go out of their way at the end of the town hall, identify themselves as Republicans or having not voted for me. In one case, one gentleman said, I am a committed conservative, these are all separate individuals. And each one of them came up to me and said, we don't agree on everything, but I really respect your approach. I really like how you're going about doing this. I feel like you're actually listening to me. And to me, it's that kind of conversation that needs to happen first and foremost if we're ever going to be able to address the big problems that are in front of us, from healthcare to climate change, right, to wage stagnation, to income inequality. These are massively complicated issues. We are a very politically diverse country. We're diverse culturally as well. So the notion that we can just figure all this stuff out by being extreme or partisan is fairy tale. We have got to figure out how to first and foremost engage and agree and disagree in an agreeable fashion. If we can do that as a first principle, we give ourselves a better chance to solve all these complicated problems. We don't have any chance of solving these complicated problems as long as we remain divided and partisan. So you will not hear me engage in the partisanship and the divisiveness. I'm going to be a force, to the best of my ability, to unite people, to bring us together, and to remind us that we're all in this together.
First, just want to thank you for laying out your, reiterating your priorities in your prepared remarks. Everything you said, I think, is wonderful. 100% support.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
My question is a little more wonky, and that is, so Maurice...
I can get wonky.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Maurice Hinchy used to represent this district for a long time.
Absolutely.
And did a great job of bringing home the
We can
pork.
clap it up, Maurice.
And he did a great job of bringing home the pork, the appropriations, and there was a lot of funds that were steered from Washington to areas of need in this region. Obviously, the rules have changed around appropriations, but what is your process? How do you start to identify what the priorities are for any resources you're able to steer towards our district from Washington?
Great question. Now, there are some conversations, I'm not sure if it's still underway or if it's been determined at this point, but there were discussions about bringing back earmarks. And, you know, there could be a lot of good in that to the extent that one has the ability to be an advocate and fight for resources back home. A big reason why I chose the committees that I did was because I wanted to be on those committees that have jurisdiction over those issues that I know I can fight for funding for the betterment of my community back home. The process is going to be marrying what goes on here locally with what I'm doing in DC. That's why I have advisory councils, right? I have a Veterans Advisory Council. I'm putting together an Agriculture Advisory Council. I'm putting together a Small Business Economic Development Advisory Council. I'm going to have quarterly meetings, if not bi-monthly meetings, with each of these councils and generate ideas from the ground up and figure out how we can actually do this work. I mean, just a couple of days ago, I met with a bunch of farmers and got a tour of a facility over Don's Dairy Supplies. And he showed me an on-site milk processing plant and how it blew my mind, the technology around it, how localized it could be. It's identifying those kinds of opportunities, right, that we know we can do. You know, here in Kingston, I think it's time that we unlock the value in Tech City, right? I think there's ways in which we can identify those areas all throughout the region that have real opportunities and figure out how we can invest in them for the future. And that's what I'm going to make my business of. So as long as we have this sort of synergy between the local and the community and me staying on the ground, doing my work, working with the staff, and then bringing those ideas back with me to DC, and then sitting on those committees and figuring out where that funding is going to be appropriated and how, and fighting for it for our places back here at home, that's the process.
Hi, Congressman.
How you doing?
I'm Kevin Smith. I'm chairman of the Woodstock Land Conservancy. You talked about the importance of investing in our economy and dealing with what is now an unsustainable national debt. Can you talk about that in the context of climate change, the current path that we're on, and the risks as you see them, the fiscal risks of not addressing the effects of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, we look at climate change sometimes as, you know, this problem that is just so gigantic and so big that we almost either just talk in headlines about it or, you know, get folks who want to deny it, you know, and we don't get to a place where we can actually talk about it in substantive detail. What are those specific things that we could be investing in and doing to grow out, in a very concrete, thoughtful, pragmatic way, a green economy? I look at the climate change crisis as the opportunity to unlock our future, unlock what the economy can look like for generations to come. And you see the investment in the development, technologically speaking, that's happening in Western Europe, particularly around energy-efficient technology. We're not putting any money in that space. We ought to be, right? Similar, we could be talking about water infrastructure. Similarly, we could be talking about investment in solar, wind, and geothermal, and make sure that these jobs are growing. And we also can match this investment with investment in training, investment in education, investment in science and technology, investment in our current workforce who's going to need the assistance to work from or shifting from the fossil fuel industry to the green-based economy. This is going to take some thought. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take dedication and commitment. And I think one of the things that I've chosen to focus on is to twofold request that the Department of Energy do a study on green jobs. We have not done one in about 10 years. What is a green job for the future? And how can we project its scale moving forward to remake and rethink our economy? Two, invest in community colleges. We have a lot of good ones in our district as for pilot programs to help retrain workers to take those jobs on. A lot of folks talk about bold ideas and concepts that sound good, but also lend themselves to divisiveness and partisanship. I don't want to engage in that. I want to engage in concrete ideas. I want to engage in investment in green jobs. I want to engage in making sure we move those tax subsidies and credits that we give to the fossil fuel industry over to the renewable energy space. I want to think about carbon sequestration and carbon capture and figure out how we can incentivize our farmers through grants and subsidies to take on these technologies, not to burden them, but to empower them. Right? It takes that kind of specific, thoughtful engagement. We need a lot of that to help us solve the climate change crisis.
Congressman, I think we have time for one more question.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you again for being here. My name is Phil Bronzy. I'm with Rhinebeck Bank. So you opened up your comments regarding access to capital.
Yes.
And this is less a question and more just some commentary as you go back to Washington. As a community bank, and I think I can speak for a lot of community banks around here, we support small businesses, we support businesses that are starting up, but where we need to partner is with the SBA. One of the biggest challenges we have on behalf of our borrowers is that we will literally wait months on end for the SBA to pull together their decision-making apparatus. We can approve things, send it out to the SBA, and the lag time for them to actually get things done is egregious at this point. So I just would ask that you kind of really evaluate that as a function of what you're trying to do to get businesses access to capital, because we need the SBA as a community bank. We need to partner with them, and unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, we have to rely on them to do their job, and it impacts our prospective business customers, our current business customers, and the overall community. And just the other comment as it pertains to spending is that I just ask that you look to make sure that the efforts that you're undergoing to do strategic spending, there is some accountability behind that. Because the SBA is a prime example, something that we pour a lot of money into and get very little out of. So as you expand on that and look to do that, just, I implore you to make sure that the government is accountable, because oftentimes it falls on the small business owners in this room to pick up the government's new programs, healthcare, whatever that may be, and there's no real accountability on behalf of the government as far as how they spend their money.
No, I think you're absolutely right to point out that there needs to be more accountability in the government spending efforts. I think streamlining the process, being more targeted in how we implement the regulatory framework. We do this one-size-fits-all dynamic, which to me doesn't help everyday folks and help small community banks. As I alluded to, it was the same dynamic with the bill that was passed some months ago, the bank bill that helped small business owners and community banks by loosening up the standards and the threshold test or the pressure test, but they applied the same metrics to the same big banks that ended up getting us in the problem in the first place. And so we find ourselves alleviating some short-term pain, but exposing ourselves to long-term harm, which is going to impact everybody in the future. So it's about being smart. And you're right, if you're going to spend the money, do it wisely, right? Do it where you actually have the means to understand and the accountability measures in place to track the impact and measure the return on investment, and then revisit the spending to find out if it's actually having the impact it ought to have. So I'm with you 100% on this. And part of the backlogging issues, I would imagine, for the SBA is, yes, there's a lot of funding there, but are we actually doing the proper oversight and accountability metrics in place to see it through and make sure that we are accountable from the ground up?
Could we have a nice round of applause for Congressman Antonio Delgado, our next speaker today?
Amazing job. Thank you so much. It's a small token of our thanks. Hopefully one of many we'll have.